over the weekend I picked up this Unitronic 24-inch planer, working on ripping the unit apart, cleaning it up, getting it operational. Started by scrubbing the unit down with some Simple Green diluted 1-to-1 with water, using a Scotch-Brite pad to scour the surface. There's a lot of oils and grease and overspray and things on the surface that I want to remove. There's also a lot of sap and other things that the Simple Green's doing a pretty good job of removing with the scouring with the Scotch-Brite pad. A lot of the areas on the machine, the surfaces are fairly decent that I think I'll be able to just slightly fill and paint over. However, there are some pretty big areas like the tables around a lot of the electrical boxes and stuff that it appears water had gotten underneath the filler and started rusting, which broke the bond of the paint and filler from the surfaces. Seems like anytime I touch anything on this machine, some sawdust and dirt falls out of some crevice or crack somewhere. It's amazing how much dust can be in corners that you can't really see easily. Here you can see me vacuuming in by the motor and around the gearbox for the power feed. The power feed has some leaks that need to be taken care of, which has caused a lot of sawdust to accumulate in and around that area. Just kind of turned the sawdust into oil dry, cakey clumps of junk everywhere. So every time I hit something in there, more of that oily junk falls out. I'm just trying to keep it off the concrete floor to keep the shop a little cleaner. It was raining out today, or I would have grabbed the forklift and lifted this thing up into the air to be able to put a mat underneath of it, just to be able to protect the floor a little bit more. Probably do that tomorrow if the weather looks any better. So I'm going through the electrical system on this unit. When I got it from the original owner, they were having issues with the transformer that they had installed, not being able to operate the start and stop buttons correctly. It just didn't have the correct wiring, and it's not the correct type of transformer to use on a control circuit system. So this unit is designed for 230 and 440 three-phase. And typically in those kind of applications, you would either use a 24 volt control system or 120 volt isolated control system. This is a isolation transformer, which basically similar to how DC voltage works, where you need to be holding the positive and the negative, neutral, and the hot wire to be able to get shocked. So they use that back in the olden days for repairing old school TVs with tubes where the chassis were hot and things along those lines, and eventually worked its way into control circuitry like this. It protects you because the chassis is grounded. However, it's not using the negative, we'll call it, from the transformer. So if something goes wrong with the start and stop button up front, you're not going to get a shock because the transformer is going to be grounded to the chassis. So you won't end up earthing yourself to the ground and getting a 120 volt shock. Typically on a lot of newer machines, like I said, we would use 24 volt for that type of stuff just because it's a little lower voltage, less danger involved there. However, these isolation transformers do make it safe for utilizing start-stop buttons with higher voltage equipment. Here you can see the transformer that I have pulled out of the unit. This is just a standard step-down transformer that would be for like 208, 480, whatever you need to drop the voltage down. This could work, however, it's just not the correct style for it. And I had this control circuit one laying around that I ended up putting in. The box had a fair bit of dust in it just from them having the door propped open to have that plug-in 120 volt power for the start and stop buttons. So vacuumed it all out, took contact cleaner and blew down all these motor starters down here, and cleaned everything up. A lot of these motor starters are pretty old, but some of them it looks like maybe water was dripping in or starting to corrode in spots, some of the aluminum frames on them. But they're still working, the contacts look good in them. The other main issue with this machine is at some point in its past life, they removed the isolation disconnect and just wired them together. They must have been just isolating with a disconnect on the wall. I plan to put that back in so you can lock out right on the machine so that will walk over the wall. A few of the other items are there's a lot of these control wires for the limit switches that are getting pretty old and brittle that I'll probably end up swapping out. But overall, the electrics on the system look pretty good. The only other major outlier is at some point in its life, they bypassed the fuses for the motor protection for the main motor. Plan on pulling these copper jumpers they have out of there and putting the fuses back in. Not quite sure why they did that. The previous owner that I got this unit from was unsure as well. The motor is still protected because you have the overload on the contactor down here, but this is just a double protection more for the circuitry within the building. So just slowly chipping away at things and getting this thing cleaned up and getting ready to be operational. This is the plate for the disconnect. See, it's pretty rusty, beat up like the rest of the machine. Most likely on the entire overall needle scaler is pretty great for removing this kind of paint. I use it on a lot of the machines that I've restored. Just quickly pops all the paint off the surface, and then you can just do a quick 3M pad scuff to remove most of it, and then use some type of thing like V155 or Rust-Oleum encapsulator or a few of the other rust encapsulating primers out there to stop everything. However, this piece is so small, after I'm done laying out for the isolation switch, I'll probably take it into work and just blast it with some garnet, clean it all up, and get it ready for paint. Here I'm working on laying out the holes for the isolation disconnect switch. This device I'm using is called an optical center punch. They're great for lining things up. You can either have this one, which is a circle, or there's another optic there that has a crosshair for lining up. So you basically place this device over top, and the acrylic rod captures the light and brings it down to your marking, and then you can look in through this sight and line it up perfectly. They're helpful when you're laying out really precise holes. However, I've gotten so used to using it that now I just like to use it on almost every hole I do. The benefit to them is when you're using a regular center punch, you kind of have to lay it on the side to see where it is, and as you're rolling it up, you could move it and you're kind of poking around, where with this unit, you can get it exactly where it needs to be with the holder, hold the holder perfectly still, and swap in the punch, and it never moves on you. You can get them relatively cheap on Amazon and other places. Another added benefit is when you lay out a hole with a circle like I did and no crosshair, you don't exactly have a perfect center reference. So with the optical center punch having the circular sight, you can center up the two circles on each other fairly easily. I've sped this section up just to help trim down the video a little bit. Watch me drill with a pilot drill here and then get the final size. I typically wouldn't do drilling like this wearing this style glove. I typically wear the nitrile style gloves just because chips can reach out and grab that kind of glove and pull it in. So you just have to be very mindful when you're using a piece of spinning equipment wearing that type of glove. Here I'm doing a test fit of the disconnect switch to make sure my layout was correct before I walk over to the machine and test fit it. These main wires that went to the factory isolation switch, here I'm trimming them back. They were pretty beat up from just being inside the wire nut and fairly corroded. So I always like to, if there's enough wire, trim off the end and strip back some new copper to get a good contact. Again, I'm just going to speed this section up. Bunch of rinse and repeat here. Undo the wire nut, cut the ends off, strip it back, and place it into the disconnect switch. Here I'm getting the disconnect installed. However, off camera, I actually end up pulling the plate back out and re-drilling the holes with the disconnect switch centered at the very bottom of the factory hole. I didn't like how close the top of the disconnect and the wires were to the chassis. I was afraid that the wires would end up eventually chafing and wearing through with the hard bend that they needed to clear the top.
old, worn out flatheads can be fairly frustrating to get started into a hole. After I'm done cleaning the machine up and repainting it, I will go back and put some foam sealant tape in between that disconnect panel and the chassis just to help keep dust out. There's also a couple holes from the factory switch that I'll weld shut and grind clean just to keep dust out of the electrical cabinet. It's one of the biggest issues I've seen in other industries other than woodworking, as well as woodworking, is just the infiltration of dust into an electrical cabinet can really wreak havoc on electrical contactors, relays, and that kind of thing. So you really want to keep them as sealed and as clean as possible all the time.
Bit of struggle in there with those flathead bolts, but it's in, working. Just planning on swapping them out for some Allens or maybe some Phillips. The flats on these are pretty tore up. They're just 6mm by 1/0 bolts. I just don't have any flatheads here. Fire up the rotary phase converter here and double check voltages and everything again.
Need to be very careful when working inside of an electrical cabinet. This is fairly high voltage here. You'll see me stand up eventually after checking the voltages here when I turn the disconnect on. I always want to get my face away from an open electrical cabinet when energizing it, just because of arc flash and something could blow up.
Isolator is working as it should.
Here you'll see me test start the main motor. I have to hold down the interlock switch because the guarding's off. The belts are off of the main cutter. Just testing direction and functionality.
One other major issue with this machine was the main drive pulley for the main cutter here had come loose at some point and blown the keyway out and tore up the inside of the pulley. At some point, someone pulled the cutter head and recut a new keyway into the cutter head. But it appears that they never actually inspected and checked the spacing required for this labyrinth seal that's here and then the main cutter head bearing, because when you would go to tighten down the exterior bolt here on this big washer, the washer would bottom out on the cutter shaft, leaving the pulley just slightly loose to the point where it could rock back and forth, and it actually tore that key up that bad. That was the original key in the machine. It's cut in like a Z pattern almost. I ended up repairing this by putting in a new keyway and repairing the end of the shaft. But I also needed to make up some spacers for the backside of the labyrinth seal to space it out so it wasn't bottoming out when you would go to tighten this down. And I also had to space out this main spacer. You can see that spacer back there, because the backside of the pulley was worn and this spacer had worn. So there was roughly 115 thousandths that needed to be made up with spacers in different positions due to wear from this pulley slipping. 10 horsepower, chewing through material at 65 feet a minute. You're talking some serious torque on that shaft, so it's not surprising that this keyway was just completely mangled. Eventually, I plan to put a carbide cutter head in here, which will permanently repair this unit. However, with the current setup that I have, it should be good for the light work that I'm going to be doing on it. I don't ever foresee myself needing to run this unit at 65 feet a minute. That's absolutely booking. I'll mostly be just milling small slabs and small pieces with this unit. Looking over the whole of the machine, some of the other items that I need to address are this chain has worn over the years, stretched out. Plan to replace that. However, just to get the unit going for now, I'm going to remove a link from it. The adjuster is currently full tight, as you can see there. And there's still a good 4 or 5 inches of movement there. The gearbox for the table raise and lower also seems to be leaking. Probably eventually pull that out and take a look at it and see what's going on. Here's a shot of the feed gearbox. You can see it's been leaking, and this is after I've cleaned it up. I don't believe it's ever been pulled out to be serviced, so I'll most likely pull it out in the next couple days here. Pull the top off, check all the teeth out, clean out the box, and reseal the unit. Not sure when the last time the oil was changed in that. Here's the gearbox from the side. You can see the shifting arms. All the linkage on everything seems pretty decent. From the chain side of thing, all the sprockets are in pretty decent shape. This one's slightly hooked a little bit. However, most of them are fairly decent, even for as worn as this chain is. Overall, the underside of the machine really needs a good cleaning. There's just years of dust and dirt, paint from the shops, and different items that are just caked all over everything within this cabinet. You can see up in there. It's always amazing, old woodworking equipment, how much sawdust can build up in places. No matter how much you clean, there's always more dust there. So the plan to pull all these sprockets off, just clean everything up, clean the chain up for now, unless I can get a new one relatively quickly, and just put the thing back into service. I also want to pull the kickback paws out and just clean these up. They all move freely, as you can see. They're good, but they're just coated with grime and grit. Could use a good cleaning. All the segmented rollers are in good shape. They all move freely. I believe the previous owner had already pulled these out and cleaned them. Poking around on the machine more, I ended up deciding to pull the gearbox out to be able to get some access to other items that needed attention while cleaning up, getting ready for paint.
pulling the drive chain out here. I end up starting to look it over to try and see if there's a size written on it. A lot of times they'll have stamped on the end plates the brand and what size it is. However, this one just has the brand, so I'll have to measure it to determine what it is. At this point, I'm realizing that I forgot to remove the trim ring on the feeder gearbox around the fill tube for the oil for the gearbox. I end up removing this, but also putting some cribbing underneath because I wasn't sure how exactly I was going to get it out of there, and I didn't want the back of the box to drop down and smash into something. Compact machines are great until you actually have to work on them. Wrestling this gearbox out of here was a little bit awkward. It wasn't too bad. It's not very heavy of a box. It's not that big, but it's just an awkward position for sure. Wasn't fully planning on pulling off the gearbox tonight. However, just looking over some more things, I found that the pressure tension cables are pretty tore up, and this one roller in here when I was cleaning up is actually seized, so it started to wear through the PVC or vinyl coating on the cable and actually started digging into the cable. And the only way to access the bolts that hold that roller in was to have that gearbox out of the way. So here we are. Pulled the box out, so I'll pull that apart, clean it up, see what's leaking on it, see if any seals need to be replaced, and get this roller out back here. I was able to get a new grease fitting on it and pump grease into it. However, it still is not rolling freely, and it seems to have loosened at some point. At first I thought it was just wedged onto the frame, and that's what was causing the problem with it not moving, but that was not the case, sadly. So hopefully, pulling apart, I'll be able to get it cleaned up and get it moving, freed up. Grease pump through both sides, and typically when that happens it'll start rolling, but it's just not the best spot to have leverage to get it moving and cleaned up, so might as well do it right, pull it out. I will most likely make up new tension cables for the pressure bar. There's a system over here and over here, and then some linkage underneath here that as you adjust this adjuster here, it pulls on those cables, and that's what this indicator is showing. But they are so worn and loose that they just need to be replaced or tensioned a fair bit, but it looks like they're almost at their maximum already. So here we are, but that's all for now. Here's the gearbox pulled out of the planer. See, it's been leaking for a fair bit. Sawdust turned into somewhat of an oil dry. I believe it's just all coming from the cover. That's what it looks like, or maybe somebody's spilled something, or maybe there's an O-ring on the top of this. That's possibly what's causing it. Yeah, the O-ring's completely missing there, so that's most likely what the issue is, but got it out. Might as well pop the top on it, see what it looks like. I'll put this thing in the parts washer and get it all cleaned up. Pretty much all I'm going to do in this video. Just going to continue to keep cleaning this stuff up. This
The front's pretty beat up. Most of this is gonna have to get either scaled off or ground down. It's just a lot of chipped body filler. Looks like from boards bumping into it when they were putting it onto the unit here. But in the end, it'll be a very good planer. Picked up for a decent price. Just a lot of little things that need to be taken care of and cleaned up. All this linkage for raising and lowering the rollers. Just all needs a good lube and clean up and some pins tightened up and that kind of thing. Catch you guys on the next one.